According to the latest official data published by major economists in Southeast Asia, the Philippines remains the fastest-growing economy in the region, expanding by 5.6% in 2023. This is followed by Vietnam and Indonesia, growing by 5.05% and 5.04%, respectively. Malaysia expanded by 3.8%, while Singapore experienced minimal growth of 1.2%. Thailand is estimated to have expanded by 2.4% last year. In the fourth quarter of 2023, Vietnam recorded the highest economic expansion at 6.7%, followed by the Philippines at 5.6%, Indonesia at 5.04%, Malaysia at 3.4%, and Singapore at 2.8%. For next year, the ADB has retained its growth forecast for the Philippines at 6.2%. This forecast places the Philippines ahead of its regional peers, with the ADB projecting Vietnam will grow by 6%, Indonesia by 5%, Malaysia by 4.6%, Thailand by 3.3%, and Singapore by 2.5% next year. The ADB's 2024 GDP growth forecast for the Philippines aligns with the 6.5% to 8% growth goal set by the government. According to the latest forecast by the International Monetary Fund, Southeast Asia's GDP is still led by Indonesia, with a nominal GDP of $1.4 trillion, followed by Thailand at $526 billion. Singapore is in third place with a GDP of $497 billion, while the Philippines is in fourth with a GDP of $435.6 billion. Malaysia is in sixth place with a GDP of $438 billion. By 2024, the ranking will remain the same, but by 2027, the Philippines is expected to become the third largest economy, surpassing Singapore, and in 2028, it will become the second largest economy after surpassing Thailand, with a nominal GDP of $698.5 billion. In the longer term, the Philippines is projected to be among the top 15 largest economies in the world by 2075, as emerging markets are expected to outgrow their developed counterparts. Goldman Sachs forecasts that the Philippines will be the 14th largest economy globally by 2075, surpassing France, which is projected to fall to 15th place by then. The Philippines is one of two Southeast Asian nations on the list, with Indonesia expected to become the fourth largest economy in the world by 2075. The Philippines is often noted for its export of services rather than manufactured goods, with the IT-BPO industry and services provided by overseas Filipino workers constituting nearly 20% of the country's GDP. According to the IT and Business Process Association of the Philippines, the total IT-BPO headcount reached 1.6 million in 2022, with revenues rising to $32.5 billion. The country holds a 10% market share in the global IT-BPO market. Emerging economies led by powerhouses in Asia are growing more quickly than developed ones, even as global GDP expansion slows. Their share of the world economy will continue to rise, with incomes expected to gradually converge toward those of richer countries. Meanwhile, China and India are projected to be the first and second largest economies in the world, respectively, by 2075, surpassing the United States, which is expected to be in third place. China is expected to overtake the US around 2035, while India should catch up by 2075. Despite China and India being projected to have larger economies than the US by 2075, Goldman Sachs's projections imply that the US will remain more than twice as rich per capita compared to China and India. Among emerging markets in East and Southeast Asia, the Philippines will have the highest average growth between 2024 to 2030 at 6%, followed by India at 5.8%, Indonesia at 4.3%, and China at 4%. Improving domestic demand in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines has supported the rebound in economic growth momentum during the first half of 2023. Over the long run, the ASEAN region is expected to overcome the protracted negative economic shocks caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and continue to be one of the fastest-growing regions in the world economy. This rapid pace of growth will be driven by both exports and domestic demand, highlighting the increasing importance of the ASEAN region as one of the world's largest consumer markets. By 2040, ASEAN's share of world GDP is projected to increase to 5.4% of the world's economy, according to S&P Global. Before 2040, the Philippines and Thailand will join Indonesia on the roster of major global economies, reaching over $1 trillion in nominal GDP. The Philippines is forecast to become one of the Asia-Pacific region's small group of $1 trillion economies by 2033, while Thailand will join this grouping of the largest economies in APAC by 2036. Other countries in the Asia-Pacific region with economies over $1 trillion are China, Japan, India, South Korea, Australia, and Taiwan. Consequently, the outlook for the Philippine economy over the next decade is very favorable, with significant progress in economic development expected. Rapidly rising per capita GDP and standards of living will help to underpin broad improvements in human development indicators and will deliver a significant reduction in the share of the population living in extreme poverty. Over the decade ahead, the Philippines is poised to become the world's 18th largest economy by 2050, provided it addresses its infrastructure needs. A long-term projection by London-based macroeconomic research organization Capital Economics indicates that rising per capita GDP levels will also put pressure on Thailand's competitiveness in certain segments of its manufacturing export industry. Thus, a key policy priority for Thailand will be to continue transforming its manufacturing export industries toward higher value-added processing in advanced manufacturing. The World in 2050 report issued by PwC enumerates the latest long-term global growth projections to 2050 for 32 of the largest economies in the world, accounting for around 85% of the world's economy. Accordingly, the Philippines and Vietnam are expected to make the greatest strides in the rankings among major Southeast Asian economies. The Philippines will rank 19th globally, moving up 9 places from the 28th spot in 2016, while Vietnam will rank 20th globally, an outstanding rise of 12 places from the 32nd spot in 2016. Other ASEAN states in the major global economies include Indonesia, ranked 4th, Malaysia at 24th, and Thailand at 25th. The World in 2050 report notes that Indonesia will remain the largest economy in the region by 2050, with a GDP of $7.3 trillion, followed by the Philippines with a GDP of $2.5 trillion, Vietnam with an economy of $2.3 trillion, Malaysia with a GDP of $2.1 trillion, and Thailand with a GDP of $2 trillion. Improving domestic demand in Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines has supported the rebound in economic growth momentum during the first half of 2023. Over the long run, the ASEAN region is expected to overcome the negative economic shocks from the COVID-19 pandemic and continue to be one of the fastest-growing regions in the world. This rapid pace of growth will be driven by both exports and domestic demand, highlighting the ASEAN region's increasing importance as one of the world's largest consumer markets. By 2040, ASEAN's share of world GDP is projected to increase to 5.4% of the world's economy, according to S&P Global. Before 2040, the Philippines and Thailand will join Indonesia on the roster of major global economies, reaching over $1 trillion in nominal GDP. The Philippines is forecast to become one of the Asia-Pacific region's small group of $1 trillion economies by 2033, while Thailand will join this group by 2036. Over the next 2 decades, the total ASEAN economy, measured in nominal terms in US dollars, is forecast to quadruple, increasing from $3 trillion in 2020 to $13.3 trillion by 2040. This will make the combined GDP of ASEAN economies much larger than the GDP of Japan or Germany by 2040. Vietnam's economic outlook from 2023 to 2026 is for rapid expansion, with GDP growth forecast to grow at a pace of around 6.5% in 2023 and sustained strong growth at a pace of around 6.7% per year over 2024 to 2026. However, Vietnam's economy faces near-term risks from a slowdown in key export markets, notably the US and EU. Multiple economists have downgraded the country's economic outlook. Standard Chartered now predicts Vietnam's GDP will expand by 6.5%, down from 7.2%. Capital Economics revised its forecast for Vietnam's GDP growth to 4.5% from 5.0%. Oxford Economics revised its forecast down to 3.0% from a relatively weak 4.2% expansion this year. Over the medium term, a large number of positive growth drivers are creating favorable tailwinds and will continue to underpin rapid growth in Vietnam's economy. This is expected to drive strong growth in Vietnam's total GDP as well as per capita GDP, with strong economic expansion projected over the next decade. Vietnam's total GDP is forecast to increase from $327 billion in 2022 to $470 billion by 2025, rising to $760 billion by 2030. This translates to very rapid growth in Vietnam's per capita GDP from $4,160 per year in 2022 to $5,390 by 2025 and $7,400 by 2030, resulting in a substantial expansion in the size of Vietnam's domestic consumer market. Vietnam's role as a low-cost manufacturing hub is also expected to continue growing strongly, supported by the further expansion of major industry sectors such as textiles and electronics, as well as the development of new sectors like autos and petrochemicals. Malaysia's economy rebounded strongly in 2022, with economic growth momentum boosted by the easing of COVID-19 restrictive measures and buoyant exports of electronics, palm oil products, and oil and gas. In 2023, growth momentum is expected to moderate due to base effects and a slowdown in merchandise exports. However, the reopening of international borders, notably in mainland China, will support the continued gradual recovery of the international tourism industry, which was a significant part of the Malaysian economy before the pandemic. There are some downside risks to the near-term growth outlook, particularly due to a slowdown in world growth. Malaysia's export sector is vulnerable to weak economic growth in the US and EU, which together account for about 20% of total exports. However, the easing of COVID-19 restrictions in mainland China could help boost Malaysian exports to this key market, which accounts for about 15% of total exports. Overall, the medium to long-term growth outlook for Malaysia remains favorable, with nominal GDP forecast to rise from around $400 billion in 2022 to $680 billion by 2030 and $780 billion by 2032. Per capita GDP is projected to rise from $11,200 in 2022 to $18,800 by 2030, which will help drive the growth of the domestic consumer market. Thailand is expected to benefit from more normal conditions for international tourism travel in 2023, providing a significant boost to the economy. The continued recovery of the international tourism sector and some upturn in GDP growth to around 3.4% is expected in 2023. Over the next decade, Thailand's economy is forecast to continue growing steadily, with total GDP increasing from $500 billion in 2022 to $860 billion in 2032. A key driver will be rapid growth in private consumption spending, supported by rising urban household incomes. By 2036, Thailand is forecast to become one of the Asia-Pacific region's $1 trillion economies. The substantial expansion in Thailand's economy is also expected to drive rapidly rising per capita GDP from $6,900 in 2022 to $11,900 by 2032, supporting the growth of the domestic consumer market and expansion of the manufacturing and service sectors. One of the key economic and social challenges facing Thailand is its rapidly aging population, which will result in increased healthcare and social welfare costs over the next 2 decades. This will be a drag on Thailand's long-term potential growth rate, making investment in technology and innovation increasingly important to mitigate the economic impact of demographic aging. Indonesia's growth strengthened to 5.3% in 2022, the highest in the last decade and stronger than the region's median growth, driven by positive terms of trade led by commodity-related exports and a recovery in private consumption. This momentum continued in 2023, with private consumption and exports supporting 5% growth in the first quarter. However, signs of moderating domestic demand include a softening in imports and investment growth, a deceleration in private sector credit growth, and a slowdown in core inflation. Since the beginning of the year, GDP growth is projected to moderate to 4.9% in 2023 and remain broadly flat at 5% in the medium term, supported by private consumption as inflationary pressures subside. Despite setbacks, Indonesia is a country with a bright future. Its large population of about 250 million represents a huge labor force and a growing consumer market. The McKinsey Institute forecasts that by 2030, Indonesia will be the seventh largest economy in the world and have a middle class of around 135 million people seeking globally produced goods and services. Its relatively young demographic also suggests continued economic dynamism. Rich in natural resources including oil, natural gas, coal, copper, tin, iron, and timber, Indonesia is well positioned for future growth.